another hat when I'm not outfitting and guiding, and that is the Wilderness Watch hat, because I've been on the board of directors of Wilderness Watch for, I don't know, 15, 18 years. I was president for a couple of years. I'm the current vice president, and I think it's a great organization that if you really love and care about wilderness, please join. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was guiding a trip on the Colleen River on the east central part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I had a group of 7 people all together. We were on the shore of the river. We had a big campfire going. And I looked up the gravel bar almost a quarter of a mile, and I saw a grizzly sow and 2 cubs. And they gradually were working their way closer to us, and you know, I'm not worried because we have 7 people. And all of a sudden, as the sow got closer, she put her head down and started charging at full speed toward our group. And I need not tell you that some of my clients, they were from New York and Chicago and California, were changing the color of their undershorts as this was happening. And I was a little bit negligent because I got a little bit overconfident with this number of people, and I left my pepper spray hooked up to the hip belt of my backpack, which was on the ground. And as this bear was charging us, I was slowly, and I wasn't particularly worried for some silly reason, but as I was picking up my pepper spray off my hip belt, a very strange thought went through my head. But by the way, my wife Marilyn Olson, who's also a very dedicated activist for wilderness, would probably tell you that lots of strange thoughts go through my head. But in this, and she's right, but in this particular instance, the strange thought that was going through my head was, this bear doesn't read the literature. It has not learned that scientists believe that grizzly bears will not behave aggressively towards groups of 6, 7, or 8 people. And everything worked out fine. I stood up with the pepper spray, aimed it at the bear, and she stopped about 30 or 40 yards away and took off and took her cubs over the mountain, and that was that. But you know, it's just another example of something I've learned over the years guiding, and I think a lot of us realize that every time we think we know something, Mother Nature tends to disprove that. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind, both about the wilderness ecosystem and about the human ecosystem, because I think we've too often fallen into the trap when it comes to conservation strategy of thinking we know how the political system, how people are going to react, and we come up with all these clever strategies instead of simply advocating what's right for wilderness and what we need to do in order to preserve wilderness and ecological integrity and large carnivore populations and everything that we hold dear. And I'm going to apologize very quickly, because I'm not going to talk about what is advertised that I came here to talk about. Part of that is because if I told the organizers of this conference what I intended to talk about, they probably wouldn't have given me a speaking slot. After hearing some beautifully eloquent statements by Terry Tempest Williams last night, in which she suggested that we reconsider direct action, that we stop compromising, that we lay our bodies down, both physically and metaphorically, is what Terry said. Hearing Ken Brower and some of the other things, I really feel compelled to talk a little bit about some of the very basic problems that are afflicting our wilderness movement these days. Because this gathering, this wonderful gathering of all these people, is a great chance to do that. And so far, a lot of the dissension within the conservation movement is being swept under the rug, and you don't solve problems by ignoring them. I live in the Gallatin Range, in southern Montana, just north of Yellowstone National Park, about a mile from the greater Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Complex. And I've been a wilderness guide and outfitter, as Gary said, for a long time, since 1978. And I've probably guided between 500 and 600 week-long, roughly, give or take a few days, wilderness treks over the years. My company's focus goes literally from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to the Gila Wilderness. I still guide trips in those areas and many other points in between. And the Yellowstone ecosystem is my primary home range. And I would love to share my guiding perspectives regarding on-the-ground conditions in wilderness with people. I'm going to be here for the rest of the day, and I'd love to do that a little bit more. But right now, I feel like there has been relatively little interchange in this conference to examine as a group, with really meaningful back and forth interchange again, the failings of and the potential remedies for effective wilderness activism in the United States. And this is my attempt to focus some attention on, at least a little bit of attention on a very big problem that I'm going to soon describe in quite a bit more detail. And let me be clear, I really want to hand it to, and I really appreciate the monumental effort that went into organizing this conference. There's been some wonderful speakers. This is just an absolutely great collection of people. Just, you know, being inspired by people like Terry Tempest Williams and Sylvia Earle and some others, you know, really warms the cockles of my heart. You know, I'd also like to suggest that at the 51st conference, we also add some people like Michael Soule, George Werthner, E.O. Wilson to the mix. E.O. Wilson, of course, and I think Terry mentioned this last night, recommends that at least 50% of the terrestrial habitats on Earth, 50% of the land area of the terrestrial habitats on Earth, be set aside as biodiversity preserves. And that's way more than any conservation group that I'm aware of, just about any conservation group in the United States, is willing to support for wilderness or park designations or any other type of reserve status. And maybe that's something we should think about. The truth is that a deep malaise afflicts wildland conservation. And certainly there are some really great activist groups out there. Groups like Friends of the Clearwater, Gary McFarland's group in northern Idaho, the Alliance for the Wild Rockies, Wilderness Watch. Obviously, I'm a little bit prejudiced there, but I'm going to name Wilderness Watch anyway. The Western Watersheds Project, Friends of the Bitterroot, the Sky Island Alliance, the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance, Swan View Coalition in Montana, many, many more. But these outfits are, unfortunately, routinely being undercut by a relatively small cadre of big national and regional groups with big budgets, and oftentimes with obscenely large salaries for their executives. Real activism that highlights education and organizing wilderness defenders has been swept aside and replaced by collaborative efforts to designate watered-down wilderness. That's where the money is. So the Pew Foundation and other funders who defend the status quo too often dictate strategy, favoring radical compromise and collaboratives, where everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya. Unfortunately, these collaboratives forge deals that make some people, not everybody, but you know, some people feel good. But it's been my experience in most situations that more often than not, the land and the creatures get the shaft. These outfits work for legislative notches in their belts. There's kind of a mentality that we need to get wilderness legislation passed at any cost. And the cost is often special provisions in wilderness bills, and oftentimes radically truncated wilderness boundaries, all of which creates increasingly human-manipulated and tame wilderness. And unfortunately, I'm not talking simply about honest differences of opinion over strategy. I personally think that airing out and having open debates over old-fashioned honest differences is a good thing. It's something that's always happened in the conservation movement. But in recent years, what's happened is the big greens, for lack of a better term, and maybe that's oversimplifying it a little bit, but some of these outfits are actually working against conservation, routinely teaming up with corporate exploiters and other anti-wilderness constituencies. There's a fine line between strategic differences and actually working to oppose the efforts of your fellow conservationists. And that line is now, unfortunately, routinely crossed. I'll give you a few examples, which is all that my time allotment allows, but unfortunately, there are plenty more. So, of course, I'm disappointed but not surprised that Wilderness Society President Jamie Williams is a conference keynote speaker, because, as I will shortly explain, his organization has, in my opinion, and in the opinion of quite a few other people, turned its back on its rather formidable history of wilderness activism. It's turned its back on the Wilderness Act and its formidable but increasingly distant pro-wilderness past. And before anybody says, Howie, you're getting personal, it's not personal. I don't even know Jamie Williams. I've never met him. He may be, he's probably a very nice man. He's probably doing what he thinks is good for wilderness. But unless we talk about these things and get a little bit more specific than some of the things that have already been said, I don't think we're going to solve any of these problems. Yet Stuart Brandborg, the former executive director of the Wilderness Society, Brandy, who helped to pass the Wilderness Act, he's the last living person of the group of activists who have actually got the Wilderness Act passed, wasn't invited to be a keynote speaker here, and don't let anybody tell you that he was, because that's simply not true. The fact is that if they really wanted them, they could have gotten them. He wanted to come. He told me this in a personal conversation on the phone just a day or two before I flew down here. And perhaps, I don't know exactly why this happened, but the fact is that he was not offered a slot until some members of Wilderness Watch complained about it and protested, and then he was offered the 7-minute slot to speak that ended up being the movie that was shown, the film that was shown of Brandy on the first day of the conference. And for those of you who know Brandy, bless his heart, this man can't even clear his throat in 7 minutes, let alone give a complete talk during that amount of time. And but unfortunately, Brandy wanted me to let everybody know that he too is truly horrified by what he perceives to have happened in the wilderness movement in recent decades in the United States. In some ways, the problem really materialized during Rare 2 when a small group of Wilderness Society and Sierra Club, Washington, D.C. based employees, I'm told that Doug Scott was kind of the de facto leader of that group, and Doug is another of the conference keynote speakers, decided that conservationists should propose less than half of the available National Forest roadless acreage for wilderness. And this was in 1978. And my old friend Dave Foreman was one of those DC strategists at the time. But to Dave's credit, he later renounced the Rare 2 strategy of minimal proposed wilderness. I think the conservation movement, and at the time I was a Wyoming representative for Friends of the Earth, and the edict came down from the powers that be, from Doug and his well-meaning friends in Washington, D.C., that the alternative W proposals for conservation wilderness, the alternative W conservation wilderness proposals should not go much over half of the inventoried acreage. And I think on a national level, and I'm not sure I have this number completely right, Bart may know, But I think the overall conservationist wilderness proposal was about 32 million acres. And there were 62 million acres inventoried in Rare 2, but actually about 80 million available roadless acres at the time. For various reasons, about 18 or 20 million acres of roadless lands was not included in the Rare 2 inventory. And constrained by the conservation movement's radically compromised vision, the Carter administration recommended a paltry 15 million acres of Rare 2 roadless lands for wilderness designation. And in my mind, this was the grandiose defeat of modern day conservation. In a way, the die was cast. The opportunity to redefine the wilderness and roadless debate on biocentric terms by advocating wilderness for all, or at least nearly all, roadless areas was blown. Millions of wild acres have subsequently been bulldozed, and with exceptions, in my opinion, the wilderness movement has, not all, but to a great extent, behaved like a beaten dog ever since. The Wilderness Society, in my mind, and again, I'm not the only person who feels this way, has fallen far. I earlier complained about their president, Jamie Williams, being a keynote speaker at this conference, and here's just a few examples why. The Wilderness Society has recently opposed efforts of Wilderness Watch and local conservationists in Georgia to keep the Cumberland Island National Seashore wild. And they've done this by supporting the National Forest, or the National Park Services, running motor tours through this designated wilderness. They actually signed an agreement with the Park Service supporting their motor tours through the designated wilderness, undermining the efforts of Wilderness Watch and other groups. The Wilderness Society has also encouraged the BLM to allow ranchers to use ATVs in the Owyhee Canyons wilderness in Idaho, even when BLM employees were very hesitant to do so. And it has supported an extremely absurd Forest Service plan to instigate prescribed fires over the entire Linville Gorge wilderness in North Carolina. And for those of you who know anything about the Southern Appalachians, that country is almost a rainforest. It's not a fire-dependent ecosystem like most forests in the Rocky Mountains in the Northwest. And Wilderness Watch has tried real hard, and I think the Forest Service has begun to back off, but the Wilderness Society supported the Forest Service in its plans to burn the entire Linville Gorge wilderness. And don't ask me why, but of equal shock value, Wilderness Society staffer Paul Spittler, who, by the way, is speaking concurrently in another part of this conference right now, produced a paper entitled Managing Wildfire in Wilderness. And that paper supported logging, road building, and building preemptive fire breaks in designated wilderness. And I quote from the Wilderness Society's paper. In short, any fire suppression activities that are allowed outside of wilderness are allowed within wilderness as well. Now, I would argue that interpretation of the Wilderness Act, and I think so would other scholars of the Wilderness Act, but regardless of how arguable that point is, my question would be, why is the wilderness working to and promoting, why is the Wilderness Society working to promote rather than restrain heavy-handed management in wilderness? Do they not recall Howard Zahniser's poignant reminder that in wilderness we must be guardians, not gardeners? And then there's the Green Mountain Lookout situation in the Glacier Peak Wilderness in Washington State. That's where the Forest Service illegally replaced a dilapidated old fire lookout with a brand spanking new lookout/visitor center. And I'm not exaggerating this. If you've ever seen a picture of what they built on top of this naked top mountain in the Glacier Peak Wilderness, it's appalling. You know, it was not replacing an old historical log fire lookout. They built quite a structure in the middle of this wilderness visible for miles around in every direction. It was a blatant violation of the Wilderness Act, and Wilderness Watch sued the Forest Service, and we won a legal slam dunk victory for Wilderness and the Wilderness Act. The Forest Service was ordered to remove the structure. But the Wilderness Society again undercut conservation by working with Congress to exempt Green Mountain from the requirements of the Wilderness Act, and Congress did exactly that. Obviously, Twist seems so determined to appease the agency that they've abandoned their mission with zeal. When Stuart Brandborg was running the Wilderness Society, there were certainly strategic differences among conservation groups, sure, but this kind of undermining just could not have occurred. Back in the 60s and 70s, the Wilderness Society and most other conservation groups understood the need to support and not oppose the grassroots. And when I cut my teeth on conservation in the mid-70s, oftentimes working with Bart, learning from Bart, who had a little bit more experience than I did at the time, respecting the efforts of grassroots groups was at the top of the list, and it's why the Wilderness Society was effective back then, because of the support it gave to the grassroots. But now we've come a long ways from that, and that was unfortunately a long time ago, long before the Wilderness Society saw fit to put people like wilderness deconstructionist Bill Cronin, the former head person of Weyerhaeuser environmental books. If that's not an oxymoron, I don't know what is. But Bill Cronin on the board of directors. Mark Rey is a paid lobbyist for the Wilderness Society. Those of you who might remember who Mark Rey is, he was a lifelong timber lobbyist who either under the Reagan administration or Bush 1 became the Undersecretary of Agriculture in charge of the Forest Service. And I mean, we're talking about the Darth Vader of the timber wars. And this guy is now a paid lobbyist for the Wilderness Society. I think, you know, one of the things that Ken Brower left us with, he talked about the need for, I think it was Ken, but, you know, we've heard about the need to love wilderness. I think most of us are here, obviously, because we love wilderness. But putting Mark Rey in a job of lobbying for the Wilderness Society, that's like putting the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in charge of lobbying for the NAACP. You know, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'd suggest that, you know, in addition to our folks loving wilderness as we do, stop hiring people who don't love wilderness. Unfortunately, the Wilderness Society isn't alone working to undermine the efforts of other conservationists. In my home region, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition recently produced a display at a recent Montana Wilderness Association convention extolling the virtues of broad-scale national forest thinning and logging for nebulous and scientifically incorrect forest health reasons. They did this as other groups work to educate the public about the folly of the so-called forest health claims that are made by some in the Forest Service and the industry. With friends like this, who needs enemies? A few years ago, the Montana Wilderness Association intervened in a lawsuit. This is particularly egregious because there was a small group of activists, very poorly funded grassroots activists from central Montana in the Lewistown area called the Central Montana Wildlands Association. And they had sued the Forest Service over a travel plan that would have allowed snow machines in part of the Big Snowy's wilderness study area. Unbeknownst to them, the Montana Wilderness Association had cut a deal with the Montana Snowmobile Association, and that deal would have allowed snow machines in a portion of the wilderness study area. But worse, MWA actually intervened in the lawsuit on behalf of the snowmobilers and the Forest Service again, undermining the efforts of this small grassroots group. We're getting a little bit low on time, so I'm gonna have to skip a few other examples, except to say that there's a lot more where this came from. It's become the rule rather than the exception. I'm involved with a small group in Montana called Montanans for Gallatin Wilderness, and we've put a proposal out there for a 545,000 acre wilderness in the Gallatin Range. And we've been undercut and undermined by the Wilderness Society, the Montana Wilderness Association, and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition in a number of ways. And I'm going to be here all day today, so if you want to talk to me about some of this in person, I'm happy to do so. You know, again, I respect strategic differences within the conservation community, but what I've begun to describe is something entirely different. In the past, I've counseled fellow conservationists to avoid public criticisms of other conservation groups. I really felt for a long time, for most of my life, for most of my career, if you want to call it that we should avoid airing out our dirty laundry in public. But I've changed my mind. The situation's just gone too far. In my opinion, the conservation movement, or at least a big segment of the conservation movement, has lost its way. John Muir, Bob Marshall, Howard Zahniser spin in their graves. The malfeasance must end. I don't know what the solution is, except to say that, you know, maybe it's time for groups like the Wilderness Society, the Montana Wilderness Association, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, to disband and get out of the way. I'm not naive enough to think that is going to happen. And I also appreciate that occasionally these outfits do good work, but occasionally doesn't cut it. Protecting our priceless heritage of both designated and de facto wilderness is not going to get any easier as the already overpopulated United States continues to expand. I was very happy to hear, by the way, Terry Tempest Williams talk about overpopulation last night. But the fact is that continued destructive behavior by the so-called conservation group simply exacerbates an already difficult situation when things aren't going to get any easier. As the population goes towards 350 and 400 million people, there's going to be increasing demands on wilderness and on everything that is even close to being wilderness, coming from every direction you can possibly imagine. In summary, recall that Ed Abbey once wrote, "The idea of wilderness needs no defense, only more defenders." That's true today more than ever. Wilderness is about restraint and humility. It teaches one that we don't know it all and that we never will. There's wisdom in the rocks and the trees, the prairies, the deserts, the tundras. Wild habitats speak to us if we listen. And one thing they tell me is to heed the wisdom of the wilderness movement's early founders and early visionaries. Now's not the time to abandon their ship. Let's quit playing make a deal and other political games and get on with the real job of what remains wild. I realize that a lot of what I've just said is probably going to be profoundly disturbing to some people. And I would have much rather stood here and talk about all the wonderful and things of concern that I've witnessed and experienced over 37 years of guiding in wilderness from Alaska to the Mexican border. But I really feel very strongly that if I didn't bring some of these things up in a very specific way to the attention of at least a portion of the people who are here, a great group of people who all really care about wilderness, then I would be neglecting a very important responsibility. Thanks for listening.
Okay. We're about out of time, but about 2 questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would add that in endorsing a legislatively mandated logging on national forests in Montana, I think it was just about all the groups that you mentioned by name endorsed that proposal. And one of the insidious aspects of their tactics is that they substitute themselves for the grassroots groups. We've been working for years to protect some of the forests that they just signed away for mandated logging, and at the same time adopted timber wars rhetoric to marginalize the grassroots groups that they had elbowed out of the way. And it's more than just a passive debate, like that they won the debate. They excluded us from the debate and got onto this slippery slope of congressionally mandated logging, overriding Forest Service discretion, overriding science. So it's very insidious. I'm so glad that you brought this subject out. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Yes.
I actually remember lobbying against Mark Rey, so I have to say I'm totally in shock that he's now lobbying. I remember being in a congressional office and arguing in favor of ancient forests, and he was following us in to argue against this. So I'm totally, absolutely in shock. I really appreciate what you have to say. I do think that this problem has to do with the fact that people running large organizations are making more and more money. And in order to make that the kind of money that a corporate executive makes, you have to bring people onto the board and corporations that give that kind of money. And when you take that kind of money, you're a different kind of person than a grassroots person that doesn't get money, that just is a volunteer. And I think that's the most unfortunate thing, is just that these organizations have required people at the top to make very large salaries, and it's changed the way, they're now thinking of themselves in a different way because of that money.
I would also say it doesn't necessarily mean that these people, are knowingly selling out, to use a rather baggage-laden term, but because human nature being what it is, it's very easy to rationalize what you're doing, especially when you spend a lot of time in the political world of Washington, D.C., where everything is based on compromise and there's almost no such thing as right and wrong. You can very easily convince yourself that my fat salary provides a nice standard of living, but if I didn't make these deals, things would be even worse. I don't believe that to be the case, but human nature is very capable of rationalizing almost any situation that one finds him or herself in. Janine.
Thank you, Howie, for doing what you did today. I just want to mention that I can't speak the way Howie does, but I got buried at 8 o'clock tomorrow in unrelated topics, but I'm going to be speaking about quid pro quo wilderness and the history of the compromise legislation that the groups Howie has mentioned have been trying to get through in the last 10 years. So it's related to this topic, and it's at 8 o'clock tomorrow. I hope some people will come in and discuss this more. Thank you, Howie.
And if I could just finish up by saying, this conference is going to go, I'm going home tomorrow morning, but this conference is going to be going on for another day and a half. And let's keep this topic alive. Let's just not let it die and go home and then go back to business as usual. There's some basic structural problems in the conservation movement, but they can be fixed if we decide to fix them. And thank you.